Coming up, winners and losers in a GZero world.
The question that matters for the world today is what happens when no one takes a global leadership role, when no one's willing to and no one's capable of doing it. And that, for me, is the GZero.
Political scientist Ian Bremmer discusses the rise of the different, China's relationship with the U.S., and the effects of the financial crisis. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
Our speaker is Ian Bremmer, and he will be discussing his most recent book entitled Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a GZero World. In it, Ian maps out the present and future of a new world order in which no single country or durable alliance of countries can meet the challenges of global leadership.
I've always been interested not in asking the questions that make us feel good, but the questions that actually matter for the world today. And the question that matters for the world today is what happens when no one takes a global leadership role, when no one's willing to and no one's capable of doing it. And that, for me, is the GZero. How did we get here? And I think that there are 4 ways that we got here, 4 different ways. Way number 1 is that there are a lot more countries that you need to coordinate with, and that's just harder, right? Larger table, even if they were all like-minded, harder to actually get them together. When you have a G20 meeting, you have a larger summit, just to get your speaking points in, never mind to truly exchange views, is difficult to do. I mean, even if you have a bunch of like-minded countries that all think that Gaddafi is a disaster, getting them all lined up takes longer than it otherwise would. And so you can remove Gaddafi eventually, but it just takes longer. And you gnash your teeth and you wring your hands about it for more than you otherwise would. That's one problem. But a second problem, Fareed Zakaria, known to most of us in this room, a good friend of mine, has written for a long time about the rise of the rest. I think that's not the problem. I think it's not the rise of the rest. We've actually had the rise of the rest before. After World War II, it was the United States. And actually, we brought a number of countries to rise. Japan, wasn't that the rise of the rest? Europe, wasn't that the rise of the rest? No, the problem we have is not the rise of the rest. If there were just a bunch of more countries like Europe and Japan rising, we could deal with that. It's the rise of the different. It's the rise of the different. No one wanted to say that. Wouldn't have worked as well in the post-American world because that was much more optimistic, but it's not the rise of the rest. It's the rise of the other. It's the rise of the countries that don't agree with us on stuff, right? It's not the rise of the bad. It's not the rise of the malevolent or the evil, but it is the rise of the different. And we, especially as Americans, have problems with different because people are supposed to agree with us. I mean, all of these countries that are now rising are poor. Let's just say it. They're poor. They therefore have different views on things like the environment, and they should. It's not surprising, right? They have different views on industrialization. They have different views on trade. They're more politically unstable. Yes, they are. Frankly, they have different economic and political systems, some more hybrid systems, but most importantly, China, of course, the world's second largest economy, going to become the world's largest economy, is a country that has an authoritarian political system and a state capitalist economic system. If that's the rise that we're seeing, do we believe that there's going to be a meeting of the minds on stuff? No, we don't. We don't. That's the second reason. The third reason is that the U.S. is less prepared to do this stuff. There are many Americans that really believe that we do not benefit, that they do not benefit from the United States being the world's policeman, that they do not benefit from the U.S. being the leader and the lender of last resort, that they do not benefit from U.S.-led globalization. Why would we fix Afghanistan when we can't fix New Orleans? Why would we do that? I mean, we have reasons in this room, but increasingly, many Americans don't accept those reasons. And frankly, I understand them. I mean, if globalization is taking away your job and opportunity, even if it's good for America's growth, you will increasingly oppose that. And we do need to understand that if the United States decides we're out of Afghanistan, we spiked the ball, we signed the deal with Karzai, we're out in 2014, and the country falls apart completely, that's a problem at the margins for the United States. I accept that. It's worse for the Afghans. It's worse for the Pakistanis. It's worse for the Indians. It's worse for the Chinese. There are lots of ways that the GZero is a problem for the US, it is a bigger problem for everyone else. And Americans increasingly realize that, right? And so it's going to be harder to get Democrats or Republicans to strongly make the argument that we should have this global role. And then the fourth reason is that our allies, who have historically been with us on lots of this stuff, sometimes more so, sometimes less so, are even more distracted than we are. I mean, come on. How much lifting do you expect Europe to do internationally while they're trying to figure out if they can keep the Eurozone together? And then I could even give you a fifth reason, which should be obvious, but nonetheless I'll throw it out there, which is that all these other countries that are rising, even if they had it in their inclination to provide global leadership, have no experience doing so. Their diplomatic corps are not as seasoned or as global. Their multinational corporations have only been global, if any of them are, for a very short period of time. They don't have the same institutional heft, durability. It just isn't happening. What does that mean? What are the implications of GZero? Well, I mean, the biggest implication is that we will no longer see US-led global institutions, right? The IMF or the World Bank or Bretton Woods or, sort of all of this architecture that was created by the United States to be global, that's done. It's over. Now, going forward, what are the choices? You can either have US-led institutions that aren't global, or you can have other institutions that are not US-led, or you can have neither, right? Now, from the American perspective, the right answer is US-led institutions that aren't global. Let me give you an example. We're all concerned about climate, right? Some of us more, some of us less, but we're all concerned about it. We all now understand it is an issue that we should be dealing with. We've now seen a number of global summits on climate: Copenhagen, Durban, Cancun. How many global summits do we need to have that end in complete failure before we understand that global summits will not accomplish anything, right? The answer to that is stop doing global summits, right? The answer to that is find a coalition of the willing. Find a smaller group of like-minded countries that can do something. It won't be ideal, it won't be optimal, but it will be something. And if you do it soon, maybe there'll be adaptation. If you wait, maybe it'll be mitigation. If you wait longer, it will be geoengineering, but it will be something, right? On trade, we are starting to get this joke. We understand as Americans that we are done with doing global trade deals. They won't work. And so instead of pushing for Doha, which no one talks about in Washington anymore, we talk about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a smaller group of like-minded countries to do deeper trade arrangements. The US, Mexico, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. We need to see coalitions of the willing on economic statecraft and on cybersecurity and on monetary policy and on trade and on climate, and keep going and keep going. That's what we need. That is an honest-to-God policy recommendation. In a GZero world, winners and losers are different. The old environment, you focus a lot on growth. US-led globalization, we're very excited about growth in that environment. Emerging markets across the board get very attractive, and you just see which ones are aligned with globalization. In a GZero world, risk is much higher. Volatility is much greater. There are a couple of things that come from that. Number one, you don't just look for growth. You look for growth and resilience at the same time. Resilience becomes much more important. Developed states look comparatively more attractive, much more flight to quality. That means, yes, people go to the yen. It means, yes, people turn to Germany. It means, yes, people turn to treasuries, right? The U.S. is not a loser in the GZero world. The problem the U.S. has is what I call the safe haven curse. You've heard of the resource curse. You have lots of resources in the ground. It allows you to not bother with political and economic reform until it's too late because you can just take advantage of the money. The safe haven curse is the U.S. equivalent of that in the GZero. Everyone's concerned about global risk, so they continue to plow money in U.S. treasuries. S&P downgrade us? Go ahead, downgrade us, S&P. Do it again. We don't care, right? Because you have nowhere to go but U.S. treasuries. And that means that we don't need to engage on the deficit in the near term. It means that if we do nothing in 2013, that's okay. The problem, of course, is that long-term we create more unsustainability. That's the curse. The other winners are countries that can pivot. They're countries that can adapt. Because in a world of much greater risk, where resilience is more important, you want options. You do not want just growth that is stuck to one country. You don't want to be Taiwan, which grows like crazy as long as China grows like crazy, right? Mexico versus Canada, big story here. Mexico looks really good right now, but Mexico has the potential to look a lot worse. It's all about the United States. It's remittances, it's tourism, it's trade, it's drugs, it's all U.S. When I was with the Canadian Foreign Minister, John Baird, a few months ago, and the first thing, he said, I'm very proud that as Foreign Minister that my first trip when I got the position was to China and not to Washington. Why? I asked, well, because, the West is in inexorable decline and Canada's future is in Asia. The Canadians are more capable of pivoting than the Mexicans, but there are some countries out there that are incredibly capable of pivoting. Look at Turkey. We have the ambassador right here, so I'm going to put him on the seat. I believe your country's opened 12 embassies in Africa in the last year. Those are countries that these guys couldn't find on a map 10 years ago, right? They've hurt their relationship with Israel, right? I mean, Erdogan's done that politically. And yet, that has made it much easier for them to work with just about everybody else in the Middle East, right? In other words, some of that is quite strategic. It used to be last year, 2 years ago, Italy was the second largest trading partner for Turkey. Today, the second largest is Iraq. So the Turks can do Russia, they can do the Caspian, they can do the Middle East. They're candidate members of the EU process, but will never become actual members. Turkey actually pivots well. Indonesia pivots well. Vietnam thinks they pivot well, not sure they do over the long term. Pivot states become important in this environment. So growth and resilience, very different kind of investor mix. We don't do emerging markets across the board. We worry about countries that are potentially shadow states, that are only in the shadow, politically, economically, or strategically, of one large major country. Now, what does this mean? Where are we going? What's next? Because the GZero is not sustainable, right? It's a vacuum. It's a vacuum. And in a vacuum, you will not have responses to crises as they grow. And those crises will get larger, right? And I'm not saying this to be a pessimist. I mean, I'm actually a pretty optimistic guy. I'm just saying that we're heading through this unusual period of geopolitical creative destruction. It is an interregnum. What comes next? What is on the other side? Two questions you need to answer. Number one, what's the relationship between the U.S. and China, two most important countries economically in the world? Second is, how much do other countries matter to global outcomes? Do they matter a lot or a little? If you can answer those two questions, you know where we're going to go. Number one, U.S.-China getting worse, getting more confrontational, right? And that is, I think, fairly clear. We're getting better at managing the problems as they come up. We are, actually, because we understand the importance of the relationship. China is experiencing the same part of the global slowdown that everyone else is. The Chinese response to that will be, oh my God, we can't export the way we used to, so we must double down on what we can do, which is state capitalism, which puts the Chinese in a much more antagonistic relationship with the U.S. It would be so much better for us if the Chinese were growing 15% than if they're growing at 6%. Because at 15%, they can afford to be more flexible. At 6%, they can't, right? That's bad. It's also better for us if they grow a lot, just economically speaking, but of course worse for the world from a commodities perspective. I think the U.S.-China relationship deteriorates. I think it has been deteriorated. I think it will deteriorate. I also think other countries matter a lot, and they matter a lot in part. They matter a lot in part because we won't do as much and the Chinese won't do as much, so it'll give them diplomatic space. But they also matter a lot because some of them are actually starting to matter more. And yes, the Turks, and yes, the Brazilians, and yes, the Indians over time, and also Europe, which I fundamentally do not believe craters, but I believe that this is a crisis that will make them stronger, ultimately. And if that's true, if other countries are going to matter a lot, and if the U.S.-China has a more confrontational relationship, then the world that comes after the GZero has no global institutions, it's regional. It's a world of regions. Regions matter a lot more. What's interesting is it's not globalizations, lots of little globalizations, because those regions will be radically different from each other. In Europe, common political and economic values. In Europe, largely voluntary, largely institutionalized. In Eurasia, coercive, security and energy relations towards Russia, much more informal, much less institutionalized. Middle East, you don't have one driver of integration. You've got 3. Maybe 4 over time. You got Turkey, you got Iran, you got Saudi Arabia, maybe you get Egypt. Maybe you get Egypt. They all want different things. What's driving integration in the Middle East is sectarianism. The Saudis support Sunni Arab monarchies. The Iranians support Shia disenfranchised populations. The Turks largely support middle classes secularized in the urban centers. As nobody else plays a big role in the Middle East fragments more. Dangerous. Dangerous situation. And in Asia, life gets really interesting in Asia because in Asia, you integrate towards the Chinese economically, but you want to keep your integration with the West and the United States from a strategic perspective. For how long can you do that? It gets more challenging over time to keep your ability to pivot in Asia. Africa pivots really well. They do very well in this environment because there's no natural one country, but everyone wants to come in. And Latin America is quite insulated from this environment because you don't have natural geopolitical players. And so they're also able to take advantage of many. That's where I think right now we see the world evolving post G0.
You know, we were lucky in a sense that Britain was declining, that word, right, and sort of passed the baton to us right as we were able to step in, and that liberal empire kind of kept going. And we are not so lucky. There's no. Who do you think the next candidate for the 20, 40 years out is to take that banner of the empire? Will it be liberal?
Who is next? Who's after the United States? Well, first of all, you asked like in 40 years, which is probably the right question, because in 10 years and 20 years, nobody is next. In 40 years, I have no idea, right? I mean, first of all, we don't do centuries anymore. You know, you think of how many countries are there going to be in 40 years? I mean, right? I mean, a lot more, a lot more. What kind of governance? How important will states be in 40 years compared to individuals, super empowered individuals? One thing that will happen if the G0 continues for a long period of time is you will get much more powerful plutocrats, because they will have the ability to hedge very effectively between an arbitrage, different kinds of trade environments and standards and the rest. That's a great environment to be an oligarch, right? That's not a liberal trend. Now, nation states were becoming somewhat less important over the last 40 years, in part because there was global agreement on architecture. When the G0 hit, suddenly nation states became much more important, but they're not handling it well. And if they continue to not handle it well, they will start to be subsumed. And I don't just mean by super empowered individuals and by multinational corporations. I also mean by agglomerations of individuals that fall off the grid. I mean, when you have large numbers of people who are very poor but can play role as global consumers through their cell phones, right? Suddenly slums become interesting, but they're not part of government. And so, well, are they important? What role do they play? Do they become autonomous? Do they become actors? How? How do we think about that? So I really think that the question is much broader than just pick a country in 40 years. I think it becomes a very interesting question and somewhat of a philosophical question.
To what extent did the Western financial crisis tilt the direction of the G0, your analysis of the G0, versus broader underlying systemic trends?
Sure. I think that the financial crisis was the proximate cause. It was going to happen anyway. The question is when. I mean, if you're standing out there on a pier and the pier is eroding and waves keep hitting it, at some point you don't even need a tsunami. At some point all you need is a wave and it just buckles. As it turned out, we got a tsunami, right? Now, I would argue that we're fortunate that given that it was inevitable, we're actually fortunate it happened when it did and not in 2018 or 2028. And the reason for that is because when the financial crisis hit, the United States was still by far big man standing. And that means that the ability of the United States to play a very meaningful role in determining what kind of world comes next is actually much greater. And that's really the way we should look at it. There was no way, given the rise of the other, and given that that is structural, there was no way to put off the fact that the old architecture was broken. But it was also unrealistic to believe that we were going to dismantle that architecture before we were forced to. I mean, that would be nice. That would be the best possible outcome, would be a bunch of folks sitting in a room and saying, okay, in 20 years this probably isn't going to work, so let's get ahead of it. That ain't happening, right? I mean, that's just so antithetical to human nature on every count. So we needed the crisis to come along. We got one. We got one that didn't destroy us. It wasn't a nuclear war. It wasn't cybersecurity that brought down economies. It was a financial crisis that we got through in a couple of years. And actually, you know, it happened early. I think that in the grand scheme of things, that's a blessing. And it's an opportunity.
What do you see as the future of the European Union?
I think the European Union stays together. I think there are incredibly strong dynamics on the part of most of the core governments, certainly the German multinationals and banks, and also, very importantly, European institutions. I mean, the ECB, its entire raison d'etre, is making sure the European Union stays together. There are a lot of people in the ECB. They're smart people. They have jobs. They have families. They will work incredibly hard to ensure that their lives are not made meaningless. And I think we should not underestimate the bureaucratic inertia and strength that exists from putting together a significant union, as flawed and incomplete as that union may have been. I'm a political scientist, not an economist. I tend to look more at those sorts of features. I also realize how stable these countries are. I mean, for all of the problems that Greece has had and all of the contraction of their economy, there are no demonstrations in Greece. There's no instability in Greece, right? I mean, you've got some folks on the main square by the Grand Britannia Hotel. You've had some anarchists. That's it. The rest of the country, incredibly stable. In Portugal, as they say, they don't go to the streets. They go to the beach. That's what they do, right? I was with some Argentinians yesterday who were telling me that their friends in Argentina all laugh about Spain. They laugh and they say, look at Spain's problems. I got to tell you, any of those guys in Argentina go to Spain in the same relative perspective in society, they're living a lot better in Spain. They're more comfortable. Life is easier for them. That's just a reality. So when I say that the emerging markets, that the rise of the different, are more politically unstable than the developed world, I mean that. I mean that. I define emerging markets as countries where politics matter as much to market outcomes as economics, at least as much to market outcomes as economics. With the 2008 financial crisis, does that make me feel less that way? No, it makes me feel more that way. More that way. And that's why the S&P downgrade was so inane. Because it implies that all of this stuff is equivalent, whether you're an emerging market or developed state. It's not. That comparative stability matters. There are problems with being a developed state. There's no urgency, right? I mean, if you're an emerging market, you get this stuff really wrong, you're done. You're in real trouble. And some emerging markets are emerging, and Brazil has many more characteristics of an advanced industrial democracy than any of the other BRICS do, and frankly, than Brazil did 5 years ago or 20 years ago, and that speaks well to Brazil. But let's be clear, Brazil is not Spain. And we need to remember that.
Islamic Jihad against Christian countries. Do you see this continuing for the foreseeable future, or do you see the impetus for these terrorists and other type actions against the Christian world petering out?
Well, I think that these are problems in the United States and Europe. I don't think they're going away, but I think they're becoming more domestic and less internationalized. So first of all, the U.S. has put an enormous amount of money into tracking people coming from countries that could potentially be on target lists and packages and the rest, and they've stopped a lot of that stuff. That's been a success. It's been a success with very large economic costs. It's been a success with some cost to privacy and human rights in the United States and abroad, but it has been a success. So if that's what you're focusing on, you say you got a good grade on that. Having said that, I think one of the growing concerns for Islamic terrorism in the United States is incarcerated population, largely minority, largely black. Lots of, I mean, that's a very large and growing population. There's an enormous amount of Islamic radicalized proselytization going on inside those prisons, and those folks are becoming more of a danger and security threat, which will be harder for the U.S. to monitor and track, right? So I see that as a problem. In Europe, it's domestic populations. It's British citizens. It's French citizens who are not being integrated into those societies. And we see that across the board. And we also see hard right reaction. That's a growing threat as well. As far as the local populations themselves in the Middle East and in Pakistan and Afghanistan, clearly the violence is likely to intensify, but it's likely to become more localized. The United States is playing less of a role. Can't blame the U.S. as much for it, right? But certainly in those cases, when it becomes more localized, it also becomes more sectarian. The most violent cleavages in the Islamic world are intra-Islamic cleavages. They're not between Islam and Christianity, and we don't care because those lives haven't meant as much to us. They don't make our headlines, but they mean as much to them. This is the other side of the GZero argument, which we do need to pay attention to. the Chinese have a radically different perspective on climate than we do. The Arctic is melting. We all know this. As it melts, there are fantastic reserves underneath it. The Chinese perspective is nobody lives up there, right? And these are global reserves for humanity. And the Chinese have, some 20-ish% of the world population, so they deserve 20% of the reserves that are under there. That's their perspective. From a humanist perspective, I get it, right? I understand where that comes from. As an American, I look at them and I say, well, they don't have geographic contiguity. They are getting none of that, right? We got some space up there. We bought it. We bought it at the right time, right? We buy low, sell high. We did that. And I assure you that we will not agree with China on that. They will not be meeting the minds. And Canada can say they want to pivot all they want, but if the Arctic gets messy, I'll tell you which side Canada will be on in that one, because they won't have a choice. They'll be on our side. With China, we have to deal. This is why the rise of the different matters, right? And that's the point, is that Americans have historically been really good at pretending that we have agreement because none of these other folks have enough capacity to engage in voice to make us care. But they now do.
I have to say there was nothing relative about your performance. It was absolutely special. So thank you for coming, especially this week.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.